Hi. Hi everyone, my name is Yuxi, and I'm a PhD student at Georgia Tech School of Interactive Computing. And today I'll be presenting our SoK paper on social cybersecurity that was co-authored with my advisors, Keith Edwards and Sauvik. So many end-user SMP behaviors are inherently social. We share info about ourselves with our social networks, ask friends and families for SMP advice, and also negotiate with others to protect our privacy. So whether you call it social cybersecurity or socio-technical cybersecurity or community oversight or network privacy or any number of other names, these emergent perspectives on end-user SMP beyond the individual share a common goal: to understand SMP behaviors and threats in an ecosystem of interconnectedness and influence. So our methodology for taxonomizing the social cybersecurity literature landscape spans 3 phases. 1 is gathering relevant prior work, 2, identifying common themes across these papers, and 3, grouping themes into taxonomically significant domains. So first, we began our search with some keyword searches, such as human and societal aspects of security and privacy, and social aspects of security and privacy. And these searches quickly snowballed to include the terms above, and these keyword searches resulted in about 1,000 articles that mostly fell under the umbrella of usable security and privacy from the venues listed on this slide. So to further pare down these papers just to those that were specifically including some element of social coordination or cooperation, we asked questions like, does this work advance our knowledge of how social groups jointly navigate SMP decisions, behaviors, threats, or tools? Or does this information advance our knowledge of how SMP threats, tools, or advice affects groups differently than individuals? So for example, work on sharing passwords with others qualifies as social cybersecurity since it involves an element of negotiation and trust in others, but work on general password usage and usability does not. So this left us with approximately 100 articles. And then for each of the papers, we identified the core research question, methodology, analysis, results, and et cetera. And then we applied a reflexive approach to thematic analysis. So I performed the initial coding, and I tagged these paper summaries with granular codes like dating or password sharing or location, et cetera. And then our research team participated in repeated discussions together to iteratively organize these codes and generate categories from these codes. So across literature, we identified 4 main behavioral domains. 1, negotiating access to shared resources, which includes sharing media accounts, devices, files, physical access to workspaces, rideshare, houses, etc. Shared and social authentication, which includes user reliance on others to help them authenticate, as well as systems that facilitate group authentication. Managing self-presentation, which includes disclosing personal info to build trust, self-censorship, audience selection tools, context collapse, and curating public profiles. And finally, influencing others' SMP behaviors, which includes consulting with friends and family for advice, sharing experiences with others, social proof nudges to influence behaviors, and cross-cultural consideration for appropriate SMP advice. And then within each domain, we also looked at how these behaviors differed across different levels of social distance, which was loosely adapted from Hall's proxemics theory. And proxemics is the study of how people non-verbally communicate their level of intimacy with each other by arranging each other within like a physical environment. So Hall identifies basically 4 spaces: the intimate space, the personal space, social space, and the public space. And these scales are just a generally canonical reference for work on social relationships and interpersonal distances. And then within computing, these scales, of course, extend beyond physical proximity. And then for SMP behavior specifically, as we unpack in the slides to come, the ways that romantic partners, families and households, social acquaintances, and the public share resources, credentials, advice, and about themselves with each other are all distinct from one another. So let's move on to the meat of the SoK domains. In this section, we consider the sharing of digital services like Netflix, banking, work accounts, physical devices, and physical environments. So there's often a necessary conflation between sharing content and sharing the authentication information that facilitates access to the content. Even though passwords and PINs generally come with the advice to never be shared, partners and households do so anyway via granting access to devices, media, finances, etc. So we include the majority of password sharing practices in this domain. So within intimate relationships, partners share a variety of devices, accounts, and resources, bank accounts, media subscriptions, calendars, like I mentioned before. But these sharing practices also present significant psychological hurdles, especially when the relationship ends. And within the context of intimate partner violence, or IPV, these hurdles grow. Due to the intimacy and in-person nature of these relationships, abusers can easily access the survivor's devices and accounts. Within family and households, there's actually a lot of similarity to intimate relationships, but more broadly, there has also been empirical work on how smart home devices can unintendedly share personal information with other household members. Within social acquaintances, there's been participatory design work on encouraging groups of users to envision social solutions to the access and SMP problems they face as groups. But more specifically, we find that people in the workplace frequently share passwords with coworkers via unofficial means like Slack, email, and Post-it notes. And while there are technical systems in place for access control, such as like keycard access to physical makerspaces or work environments, these systems are typically static and don't contain a lot of nuance, such as like if someone has to access a space in an emergency. And then finally, within the public, there is little social SMP literature actually, but there are a few case studies about tensions in trust and privacy and car, ride, and accommodation sharing with strangers. Specifically, there's been like evidence of this negotiation of trust where users want to know more about those who are sharing resources with them, even when they're trying to hide as much info about themselves as possible. And there, as a result, have also been a few examples of work specifically trying to anonymize riders in rideshare apps. And here you might notice that some of these are highlighted and some of these are not. I'll go over what these mean later on, but just kind of keep them in the back of your minds and like maybe consider why they're different from the others. So moving on to shared and social authentication, we consider situations where authentication credentials are shared for purposes other than giving access to a resource, as well as systems designed to support group authentication. So as previously mentioned, sharing passwords and sharing access to resources are often conflated, but we didn't find specific literature on joint or coordinated authentication by couples. But within family and households, there has been some work done on users who face accessibility challenges, relying on their family or close household members to help them authenticate themselves. And these include people with visual impairments, those with language barriers, and users who have less technical education who might share their passwords and PINs, not to actually share their financial resources, but because they face burdens communicating or proving their identities. And then in the workplace, there has been past work on the pitfalls of updating or removing credentials. So for example, when commonly shared passwords don't get updated often enough, people who leave the company can have unauthorized access. And then in place of passwords, researchers have thus tried to design more like, quote, socially aware systems. For example, there's trusted contacts on Facebook where users can rely on a specific list of friends to help them log in if they ever get locked out. And other examples employ shared knowledge or secrets, such as identifying friends in photos to authenticate group membership, or secret knocking or tapping patterns, which are individually like distinguishable since different people knock in different ways. And then once again, at the public scale, there are fewer examples of coordinated authentication behaviors, but we did find work on Nextdoor, which is a neighborhood-oriented social media platform, which authenticates users' membership in a physical community by either physically mailing them a unique code or relying on neighbors to vouch for them. And here again, notice that there are a few more use cases highlighted than in the previous section. Managing self-representation refers to the way that users share information about themselves to their social circle. So this sharing, unlike sharing resources in the first domain, specifically means how users share their personal information. So in intimate relationships, people hide information about themselves because they're embarrassed or worried about doing something wrong, but also to share to establish trust in their partners. But IPV survivors actually face pretty unique challenges. So for example, when leaving an abusive situation, survivors might create profiles with false information about themselves so that their abusers can't find them. But they bear this burden themselves, and there aren't other like existing systems to help them do this more naturally. Within families and households, most work refers to how parents leak information about their children online, whether through posting photos of their kids or through surveillance apps that themselves leak data to unknown third parties. And then at the social level, some users manage interpersonal relationships as a proxy for controlling who can see their posts, since context collapse means that their direct control over these audiences is diminished. So for example, teens and younger adults use coded language or self-censor themselves online instead of like using existing audience selection tools. And then conversely, older adults are less concerned with context collapse and would prefer to like, quote, lock everything down and like not post at all about themselves. But even when adults adopt habits from teens to signal information about themselves, For example, via checking into locations online or sharing certain digital music playlists to appear cooler to those around them, rather than like legitimately wanting other people to hear their music. And finally, within the public, as users conduct more of their lives online, the boundaries between intimate and public relationships are increasingly fuzzy. Of course, in online dating, users often purposefully hide themselves from people they know and are wary of revealing about themselves, even as they extensively research potential partners. This hints at some sort of socially expected public sharing, but the extent of this sharing is not super clear. So for example, users on Grindr feel compelled to hide their HIV positive status due to fear of stigmatization, but other users actually purposefully disclose the status for the very same reason. More broadly, users make assumptions of why others hide information about like health status from the public. And these assumptions might pressure individuals into revealing more about themselves than they really want to. And this extends all the way to companies like Fitbit trying to nudge users into sharing health data with insurance companies. And finally, of course, there have been end-user tools that could help users circumvent tracking and obfuscate their identities. Tor, of course, is cooperative by design in that like it requires volunteers to run relays. But even though there have been multiple similarly cooperative tools developed, these tend to resist mainstream adoption, so there aren't like demonstrable effects of like a collective coordinated use. And once again, please note that there is not much highlighted out of all the cases I've mentioned. And this final domain, advice and influence, covers how social groups can influence each other's SMP behaviors. So at the intimate level, user behaviors tend to mirror that of the family/household scale, which I'll discuss in a bit. But in IPV scenarios, because abusers often control setup of devices in households to surveil survivors, survivors must seek advice from outside of their relationship, and they might go to social workers or lawyers who might not be best qualified to give them advice. And this power imbalance continues at the household level, where the most, quote, knowledgeable or technically literate member is gonna be tasked with setting up devices and networks and giving out advice. And younger kids ask their parents for SMP advice, and older adults in turn also ask their adult children for advice. In both cases, those being consulted prefer more lockdown modes to SMP that are intended to protect those that are more vulnerable, but also kind of takes away their agency. And then at the social acquaintance level, there's been extensive evidence that simply sharing stories and experiences about SMP with those around you can instill a sense of camaraderie and social responsibility to protect and learn more about them. And observing others' positive behaviors has been found to be the most frequent trigger of change in SMP behaviors. And I will actually try to wrap up more quickly, I guess. And then at the public scale, there have been a lot of papers exploring demographic and cultural variations in how users approach SMP. So there are differences across gender, age, country, socioeconomic status, et cetera. And I cover all these in the paper. And also other work has challenged the portrayal of users as lazy or unmotivated in adopting behaviors and has instead called for more public advice that specifically targets those at risk. And finally, please note that there are like no highlighted use cases in this behavior domain. So throughout all of these domains, I've highlighted a few use cases, and I will discuss why they're actually highlighted. So in our SoK, we used Ackerman's social technical gap, or the difference between what users desire socially and what is supported technically, as a lens to outline potential areas for future work. So this gap is extensively cited in broader HCI literature to illustrate how technical systems may fail to account for human social behavior. So we developed 3 questions to assess this gap across all the use cases, and then I'll go through each of them in more detail. So for the first question, are there existing systems that help facilitate this social use case? The answer is kind of. Of course, like a great deal of behaviors and use cases involve some sort of technical system, but there's a distinction between extant systems that were worked around or modified to fit social needs and novel systems designed directly to facilitate these behaviors. And as an example of the former is the fact that while audience selection tools exist on social media platforms, teens choose to use coded language instead to reach their intended audience. And we also highlighted examples of the latter throughout. So for example, the social and shared authentication domain, we highlighted systems that support group authentication by using secret knocking patterns or shared secrets. We also highlighted Tor as an example that was social by design, as well as Nextdoor's authentication methods. But overall, there are a few examples of these novel SMP systems that require direct social interaction, specifically in the advice and influence behavior domain. And on the second question, can users fit the affordances of existing SMP systems without altering their ideal social behaviors? Short answer is no. Many SMP systems are designed to be ignorant of social context and force users to choose between security and social accessibility. So like even in domains without direct technical even though like audience selection tools, like I mentioned, exist on social media platforms, teens like choose actively not to use them. And even in domains without direct technical system, like influencing other SMP behaviors, users are expected to abide by institutionally set advice for existing technologies. And finally, the last question, can users use these existing systems as intended to meet both their ideal social behaviors and SMP goals? And once again, typically no. So I'll go back to passwords and personal devices again. They're not designed to be shared, but people do it anyway. And since these devices and passwords fail to account for human social behaviors, these systems no longer serve their intended purpose. And this shift in intent also means that SMP preferences fall by the wayside. So like when a user shares their Netflix account, they're burdened with making their private account details visible and having personalized recommendations being disrupted or exposing their password to others. And like this may change how they use the app entirely. And like production-ready systems like Tor and like also Track Me Not and Ad Nauseam, which also employ collectives for obfuscation, exist. But also, like once again, they're not widely adopted. So to summarize, across the majority of social cybersecurity work, there has been extensive evidence that users must either modify their ideal social behaviors to realize their SMP preferences, or modify their ideal SMP preferences to reduce social friction. So where do we go from here? There's been a lot of work that identifies the social inadequacies of SMP systems. So in that sense, we see a need to design systems with more social observability, cooperation, and stewardship. And we also found little existing work, theories, or systems, or empirical or otherwise, on the public social scale. So we think that collective action systems could be explored as a mechanism for users to directly advocate for more human-centered SMP solutions, especially against things like web tracking and surveillance technologies, rather than relying on experts to tell them what's right. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you so much for your amazing talk. Loved how you summarized all the research that there ever was on this topic in a couple of minutes. Before someone else can get a question in, so if someone wanted to actually, work in this field, after reading your paper, where should they start? Where were they like? Did you find any like gaps and holes? Where like, there should have been research on this, but there wasn't.
I think something that is like sticks out most, that's like most actionable right now, is like ending account sharing. So like, for example, if you break up with someone and like you shared your Netflix password with them, you kind of have to either have an awkward conversation or like secretly log them out and stuff. And I'm sure there could be like better ways to like design something like that. And this also extends to things like utility bills, like people who used to live in the same house as you or like share other resources. That it's like, I think that's like a very actionable domain. Yeah.
That makes sense. That's interesting. I want to say, like, from a threat perspective, would you say the majority of like what you were looking at was more like this is terrible, or would you say it's more like from a usability perspective, or more from a this is impractical but it's not terrible perspective? What's like your overall assessment of where we are?
I guess like my overall assessment is like everything is not like super ideal. Like users can eventually get to the things they want. Say, like just to use the password sharing example again, like they can eventually just like change their password or like have an awkward conversation with their ex or whatever. But like that's not like ideal. Like that could be avoided if there were like better ways to like technically support that.
Thank you. Thank you for this assessment. Does anyone else have a question in this room? All right, doesn't look like it. Thank you again for your talk and your paper.